We need to remember that we are all very much vulnerable to these things, and to actually think that you're not vulnerable to that you're too intelligent, that you're too smart, that you're way better than everyone else makes you vulnerable, in fact, to cults and groups like this. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name is Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapist things on this channel. Today, we're talking about cults. I've been meaning to make this video for a hot minute because the psychology of cults is an interesting topic, and especially with the Ruby Franke, Jody Hildebrandt situation, I think there's some good educating that we can do about the subject. So, commonly the question is asked, like, why do people join cults? How does this happen to people? And like, especially the idea of like, surely you would see this coming, right? How could you not know that this is a cult? And the truth is that it is both more simple and more complex than that. So I want to talk about that. I want to educate about that and also give you some things that you need to look out for, because the truth is that we are all vulnerable to cult recruitment, ultimately. Before we get into this video, also, I want to give a very, very loud and serious trigger warning, because we're going to talk about cults and manipulation and psychological torture and all those types of things, but we are also going to talk about death and murder and suicide, religious abuse, trauma, sexual assault, a lot of things that are very, very triggering and very heavy. So if you're not in a place for that, please make sure that you're taking care of yourself. I'll put a playlist up here that's like cute, happy, fun times, no potentially triggering content if you need an exit strategy at any time. So there are a couple of things that make you vulnerable, like a vulnerable population to cult recruitment. And so I want to talk about that first, because ultimately, like, the first question we need to answer is, why do people join cults? Okay, so let's be clear that, first of all, nobody chooses to join a cult. I'm sure maybe some people do, but generally speaking, no one is looking to join a group that they know is going to cause them harm on purpose. That's not a thing, really, that happens. What happens often is that there is this kind of perfect storm of vulnerable people and these very self-obsessed and power-hungry people that sort of like combine to create a perfect storm that ultimately is a cult. There are several factors that make you vulnerable to cult recruitment that I want to talk about. Before we do that, though, also, hi. If you're new, you should subscribe, because I'm trying to get to 200K. I would love to be able to sell you guys stickers, and I can't do that in my merch shop until I hit 200K. They won't give them to me. So if you could subscribe, that would be great. Okay, so the first thing that makes you vulnerable, potentially, to cult recruitment is feeling isolated. I've talked about this a lot on the channel. As it turns out, feeling isolated and alone is a risk factor for a lot of things, one of them being cult recruitment. Because ultimately, if you are a person who feels like you're just sort of adrift, right? You're like lacking in connection and community, people who are cult leaders that sell you this idea of like family and connection and love and people who are like you and people who get you, very appealing, right? So if you lack that in your life, it's much easier for somebody to sell you this sort of idealized image of that and for you to be very seduced by that. Also worth noting is that if you already have community and family and people who love you, first of all, you're less likely to cut and run when things get weird, because the thought is like, well, I want this group, right? I want this community. And so maybe I like this and I don't like that things are starting to get weird, but maybe this is worth it for me, right? Along with that is that if you have family and friends and loved ones who are there for you and checked in with you, there are like more choke points along the way for those people to be like, hey, right? This is weird. This is not good. Maybe you should stop. And so if you lack those people, then those people aren't there to pull you back and to say like, this is weird, you should leave. That's why loneliness, a sense of isolation is a really big risk factor for being sucked into a cult. Also worth noting here is like a general sense of inadequacy and like inefficacy. If you don't like yourself, it's much easier for somebody to manipulate you, because oftentimes, especially when we're traumatized, that's another risk factor for cult recruitment, by the way, is like severe and repeated childhood trauma. If we have been traumatized and we don't like ourselves, or we have attachment issues, that makes you vulnerable to cult recruitment, especially because what they do is they sell you this idea of like enlightenment and revelation. You're going to transform yourself, right? There's a lot of like leveling up type of stuff. That's, again, very appealing to people who don't like themselves or are interested in self-improvement, and especially the thought that like, I don't deserve community and connection because I'm not good enough. And so this person is promising me leveling up my life and being a better person, and also community. Of course, you're interested in that. Okay, honorable mention to dissociation and substance abuse. It's very common for cults to be particularly heavy on substance use, substance abuse, especially in the early stages of cult recruitment, because if you are not of sound mind, again, you're a much easier person to manipulate. That makes you a target for manipulation and abuse and things like that. But also generally, like we mentioned before, previous trauma is a risk factor here as well. And so people who deal with that trauma by dissociating and by using substances are prime targets for groups like this, especially ones that use substances pretty heavily. Oh, along with that is that dissociation offers us a simple solution to a complex problem, right? Nobody actually likes trauma recovery. As a therapist, I can vouch for this. As a person who has done it and a person who helps people through it, trauma recovery is slow and it sucks and it feels really bad. And so especially if there is this group that promises you that you don't have to feel bad, that it's not going to take a long time, and that you can solve all of these problems by just doing all of these things, then again, of course, that's seductive. Okay, quick intermission because I want to say thank you to our sponsor this week, which is Delete Me. You guys know that I have worked with Delete Me a bunch, and it's because I genuinely love them and also really trust them. If you don't know, Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that helps to remove your personal information from hundreds of data brokers online. If you're not familiar, data brokers are these companies that will take your personal identifiable information, which is stuff like your phone number, sometimes your social security number, your address. They package all of that up into these profiles, and then they sell it to people, which is a huge violation of our privacy. If you don't know, I'm fanatical about privacy. I think that we should all have our right to our own privacy, and especially to maintain our own personal information. And so data brokers like this can be very scary and can also be a risk factor for things like identity theft and stalking and a bunch of scary things. Delete Me research actually shows that from 2019 to 2023, the amount of personal information about us has actually tripled, which is, again, very concerning. And this stuff can be available for free sometimes, or as little as $5 per profile. And we can't really control who wants that information. We can control, though, making it harder for those people to get a hold of it. So thankfully, Delete Me helps by removing your information from hundreds of data brokers online, and they continually monitor to make sure that you stay removed, which I love. I'm going to show you my dashboard. One of the things that I look at every month is how much information is continuing to be removed. And there's a surprising amount of it. Even as a person who is pretty conscientious, I would say, there's lots of new stuff that's getting removed every month and lots of stuff that is getting removed. So I'm very thankful to work with a company like Delete Me because I just really trust them, and it puts me at ease to know that my information is being removed from these data brokers. Delete Me also has a special code for all of my followers that you can use to protect your information and to help protect you from things like identity theft and stalking. And you can use code Mickey Atkins to get 20% off of your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/Mickey Atkins and you use code Mickey Atkins at checkout. So that's joindeleteme.com/Mickey Atkins with code Mickey Atkins at checkout. Thank you again to Delete Me for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. So these risk factors that we just talked about, all of these offer a seemingly harmless entry point into your life because what they tell you is that we just want to help you be less lonely, maybe get more serious about your faith or your religion, to get clean from addiction, especially.
The basic seminar offers lasting answers for resolving family conflicts, overcoming feelings of inferiority, removing guilt and bitterness, conquering destructive habits.
We're going to help you participate in a good cause or to be an activist. Also, things like discovering the real you or leveling up your life. All of these are common things. There's a common misconception as well that cults are only religious, conservative, alt-right groups, and that's not true.
When I heard Jim Jones, he spoke about how much he respected the civil rights movement and how important it was that we continue to live out Dr. Martin Luther King's dream.
We're going to talk later about some of the historical examples of cults, and some of them are actually progressive or, what could be seen as like leftist groups. And so cults are present in all types of ideologies and areas. And so it's not something that we can just avoid by not being like a Republican, for example. We are all vulnerable to cult recruitment, and it's important that we pay attention to the warning signs, which, let's be clear, that cults often start as sort of innocuous and benign interactions, like clubs and groups and things like that. Jonestown, the actual cult's name was the People's Temple. Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, Love Has Won, Gothardism, all of those were religions or churches, right? Which provided people the benefit of community, provided them the benefit of like being serious about their faith and all of those things.
They had been victims of racism, they were victims of poverty. Jim Jones came along and offered them something.
Koresh had extensive knowledge of the Bible. He believed he could speak directly to God.
Revelation says Christ's going to come with a watch.
We have for every one of you
the answer on how to conquer any habit you have.
The Moonies hosted free dinners on college campuses. Nexium hosted these seminars, these workshops for like self-improvement for highly motivated people.
ESP Nexium is a methodology that allows people to optimize their behavior.
Synanon was a rehab for folks who had substance abuse issues.
Synanon is a real corporation. Its business is junkies.
Manson promised people enlightenment during the like free love hippie times.
The hippie culture, filled with music, psychedelic drugs, and free love, was a way to reject their straight-laced middle-class upbringings and find spiritual enlightenment. Charles Manson used the lifestyle to lure these impressionable young women to his commune.
QAnon started as an online community that just offered this idea of like the capital T truth and exclusivity and like we're better than everyone else, right? Teal Swan's group started as like digital self-help content. So also I want to be clear, let's pause here really quick, that all of the groups that I'm going to reference in today's video, some of them are groups that have been labeled definitively as cults, especially those that have had disasters or tragedies at the end of those groups. However, I am also going to reference groups and people and events today that are not necessarily cults. I'm not making the allegation that every group in this video is a cult. However, I am going to use some groups and some people to demonstrate behaviors that are similar to cult recruitment purely for the purpose of showing you what that looks like in real time. So don't get in my comments. Don't send me a fucking cease and desist letter. God damn it. I'm so sick and tired of cease and desist letters. So let's also remember about cults. The media, we as the general public, we don't typically become aware of these groups and their existence until we're like in the end stages of what a cult looks like. And so, of course, to us from the outside, we're like, I would never join a group like the Mansons, right? Or like QAnon, well, something, whatever. You get it. But it's because when we become aware of them as like the large scale public, it's because we're like very removed from the initial and benign and sort of innocuous entry point that is very seductive to people. Cults also use other tactics, though, to sort of demonstrate like the authority of their cult leader. One of the pieces of text that I used as reference and research for this video is a book called The 8 Criteria for Thought Reform that was written by Dr. Robert J. Lifton in 1961. It's one of the sort of foundational pieces of like cult analysis from the 60s, and it outlines 8 criteria for, identifying methods of thought reform that are often used by cult and high control groups, one of which is something called mystical manipulation, and a second is called sacred science. Basically what this means is that the cult will often use these sort of random events or spontaneous events and tie them to the cult leader's obvious supremacy and intelligence and, sort of like all-knowingness to try to sort of demonstrate like this group is, better than everyone else, or that we have the answers to the capital T truth because look at our cult leader, right? I think a great example of this is the way that Teal Swan talks about having predicted the pandemic in 2020. She does these like forecasts for the year. And one of the things that she talked about was that 2020 was going to be a year that included a lot of fear for folks and loneliness and social isolation. And so people were like, oh my God, Teal Swan she's predicting the future. She can tell omens. And like, really, this is giving Cosmo astrology, right? Like this sort of way that pop astrology predicts things that are applicable to everyone, everywhere, right?
Florals for spring. Groundbreaking.
I think especially a digital age, saying that people are going to be lonely is not a particularly profound take. And so also in hindsight, it's very easy for us to draw these conclusions and to say, well, of course these things make sense, right? Because we're looking at it in hindsight. So this is kind of an example of what that looks like. That's also kind of the core of this principle outlined by Dr. Lifton about sacred science. They will often assert that the group has the, again, capital T truth, which again, I think is pretty well demonstrated by the way that Teal Swan speaks about herself.
When you come in as a game changer, as somebody whose entire life purpose is to change the direction that people are going, then what you're doing is coming up against the systems that currently exist. So they have an option. They admit that they were wrong, that their entire way of doing it was misguided, that they spent their life in vain, pretty much, and that their life is not valid. It's really interesting to me that people, always want to put the emphasis on how is Teal the one making this happen, when the reality is I'm a revolutionary in this field. That is what I am. What do you think happened with Martin Luther King? What do you think happened with Christ? What do you think happened with Gandhi? Look at these people. What's happening with them is what's happening with me.
Along with that, what we're going to see commonly for cults, especially in the early stages as part of recruitment, is an endorsement from a public figure, often a well-respected figure. I think the Gothard Church and the way that Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar became this sort of like poster children for that movement is a great example of that.
And with the popularity of the show, they literally became the poster child for IBLP.
If you have not gone through the basics seminar, I highly recommend it.
The resources that ATI has are what we needed. I couldn't do it, I don't think, alone without the resources there.
Additionally, there's a concept called loading the language. We talked about this in the conspiracy theory video. If you haven't watched that, go check that. This is going to look like this sort of shared vernacular, this like weird shared vocabulary that we use, right? Very common in MLMs. That's the video we talked about it in. Sorry, that one. Go look at the MLM video. This shared verbiage, shared language rather, creates a sense of closeness, right? That we're part of this cool secret club. We have a secret language that we talk to each other in, right? It also discourages critical thinking and complex thoughts, though. The reason that oftentimes they'll do this is not just to promote a sense of closeness, but also to discourage you from thinking critically about the subjects and the morals and beliefs that they've sort of imparted onto you. You don't have to think about the answers to things because I already gave them to you, right? This is really common in QAnon and especially like very dedicated Trump worship type groups where they're parroting these talking points and they don't even know what they mean or why they dislike them. They just know that they're supposed to.
Do you believe schools should be teaching critical race theory?
No.
What is critical race theory for people that don't understand it?
See, I really don't even know.
We are also going to see heavy focus on ideas of like apocalyptic futures and saving the world comes up a lot. Heaven's Gate was, I think, particularly infamous for this issue. If you're not aware, Heaven's Gate was a cult that ended really tragically with the deaths and coerced suicides of 39 people who killed themselves ultimately because they believed that they were going to board a UFO and ascend to, you know, like a different level of existence because their cult leader told them that that's what was going to happen.
They're going to say, well, these people were crazy, they were mesmerized, they were whatever. And we know it isn't true, but how can you know that? And the only thing I can say is to us, this step of laying down our these human bodies that we borrowed for this task, it's just as simple. Like we watch a lot of Star Trek, a lot of Star Wars. It's just, to us, it's just like going on a holodeck. We figured out a day equals 1,000 years, played it out mathematically. It's roughly 30 minutes. We've been training on a holodeck for 30 minutes. Now it's time to stop. The game's over. It's time to put into practice what we've learned. So we take off the virtual reality helmet. We take off the vehicle that we've used for this task.
And again, we're going to see a lot of this type of language in the end stages of these types of cults because the thought is that like we have an answer about the apocalypse or about our next life or about transcending human existence. That comes up a lot in these groups. And so at first, you know, the language is not going to seem particularly nefarious, but as time goes on, things become more and more elevated into these more fringe-like ideals. This is very much the like boiling a frog sort of proverb, right? Like we do that 1 degree at a time. So that said, we've talked a little bit about how people get sucked in, what tactics we're using to suck people in. I want to talk to you about why people stay, because over time, cult leaders are going to use strategies to sort of pull people further down the pipeline, right? We're sort of like a funnel. Over time, we're going to try to get people further and further down this funnel to deepen their investment in the cult. One of the things that's going to feature heavily in moving people down that funnel into the pipeline is controlling very minute aspects of their life, right? We're going to talk a little bit about some stuff from Lifton's principles, but also about the BITE model. So if you're not familiar, the BITE model stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. The behavior and information specifically is relevant here because we are controlling people's access to the outside world, to the internet, to their families, and to information generally, right? Oftentimes there is a heavy focus on the cult leader being a conduit for the capital T truth, or often, especially in religious cults, it's God, right? The belief is that the cult leader either is God or that they are a vessel for God to speak to you. And so you don't need to look anything up, right? You don't need to talk to anyone else. I'll tell you what to think is usually what cult leaders sort of enforce as a hard and fast rule in these groups.
Jeff claimed he was getting direct messages from God and started pairing up people in the online community.
Some people are matched with complete strangers, people they'd never spoken to. There was a man, 100% like gay, matched with a cisgendered woman.
How is this not a sex cult now if he's forcing partners?
So when God tells you something, you need to respect it. If he says that's your twin flame, respect it.
They call it the all-seeing eye for a reason.
The problem with this is that it creates, sort of paradoxically, an isolation and a sense of insular These people become victim to the idea that they are in an us versus them dynamic, but it also sort of infers a sense of superiority, right? That our group is better than other people. So not only do we not need to talk to anyone outside of our group because they don't have the answers like our cult leader does, but also that we're better than them. And so we don't even want to associate with the outside world because they just don't get it, right? We're a special group of people that we need to stay within ourselves. And again, obviously that is a problem because it just forces people further down this pipeline. Along with that, though, I want to talk about something that is called the double bind. This is a very prominent and problematic feature of cults, which is that essentially what they do is force this idea down your throat that if you doubt the leader or the teachings, that you're not spiritually or, practically connected enough or invested enough. And so if members are unhappy or they have a sense of doubt or fear, that it's because of their own failings. And so you need to sink deeper into the research, the text, be more dedicated to our cult leader or to our teachings in our groups, right? This is a very common feature, notably of some fundamentalist people that we've talked about on the channel, actually.
His death was the sacrifice, the punishment for death that we all owed. That's why we wrestle and struggle, is because sin has permeated our hearts, permeated our world. Christ came, the perfect sacrificial lamb, died the death that we deserved.
Living in a heart posture of deep gratitude. And that's not to say that hard things aren't going to happen and that I can't be real with you all about those hard things or whatever. But I think that if I am truly living in a heart posture of gratitude, even the hard things will seem far lesser because I am living in the reality of how blessed I am.
The problem with this is that it creates this sort of round and round dynamic where if you have doubts, understandably so, about a group that's sort of fringe and problematic and dangerous to you, that it will tell you, well, the problem is you. And so just be more invested, be more invested, be more invested until we get to the point that you're so brainwashed that you just actually really do believe the things that are telling you, even though they're harmful to you. It's not just about your thought and information, though. They also control aspects of your behavior, like we talked about, meaning like your appearance, especially. It's very common for them to sort of strip you of your individuality and your identity because you're not allowed to have one if you're part of this group that you're supposed to be just sucking up whatever values and beliefs and expectations that they place on you. So this was very common. We saw this pretty notably in the Heaven's Gate cult, where they were not allowed to have individual haircuts or clothing. Gender even was removed from them.
Do you notice anything about them? Their haircuts exactly alike. Baggy clothes. No gender.
Marshall Harv Applewhite Doe is basically their god.
He promises they'll be carried to the next level of existence in a UFO.
This is also going to include things like sleep deprivation, financial abuse, controlling your food and water intake, and also needing permission from the leader to do anything. Big decisions, small decisions. They want to control every aspect of your life, basically everything.
One of the first things Dad did when he got to Jonestown was to take people's passports away from them. If you wanted to go back stateside, you had to ask his permission.
Do you want to go home? Well, then be seated and shut your mouth and don't be in my face anymore.
Jim Jones worked diligently to break apart the family unit. Everything you did was monitored.
When God tells you something, you need to respect it. If he says, you are this, respect it.
You cannot escape God's gaze. Why would you want to?
You have described yourself as the Master Christ.
I would love to be the person who comes and brings love to humanity. And that's what I see the Master Christ is.
People have a mind of their own. They don't always listen to us, and
That's okay. I don't really care. It's your life.
Have you told people to change genders?
We do not force gender change. We invite people to explore their gender polarity.
Something that you need to look out for as escalation is an expectation for consistency and commitment. In the early stages, after we've moved through the sort of benign entry point into your life, there's going to be an expectation typically for you to come back and to invest more and to be more consistently attending gatherings or teachings or classes or whatever, because they want you to be amenable to further requests and especially a heightened sense of commitment to the group and to the leader. If you notice these things happening, you need to be very antennas up about this. And especially I want to encourage people at every point in this video to talk to your safe people, to talk to your friends, your family, your loved ones, your chosen family, your coworkers, anybody. Talk to anybody about things that are potential red flags or potential warning signs for you, because the more that we can create a connection for you outside of this group, the safer that you're going to be and the more opportunities that you have for people to pull you back and to say, hey, this is starting to get weird. It's also very common for cults to have this demand for purity and also for that to come with an expectation of confession. There are two principles from Lifton's 8 principles. And really in real time, what this is going to look like is the use of shame and control to try to force you to very strictly adhere to the values and to confess when you don't do that, right? So beyond just a sort of purity culture thing, this is also going to mean no longer participating in values, beliefs, practices, behaviors that are outside of the group or outside of the group values. Especially this is illustrated in the way that Jody Hildebrandt structured her courses, which I know some of you are going to get up in my guts about Jody Hildebrandt was one person. Yes, it is possible for a cult to actually just be a one-on-one relationship. It's a common misconception that cults are these huge groups. They don't have to be. Like we talked about, Heaven's Gate was 39 people. Jody Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke was a one-on-one relationship. The Manson family had a large group of people, but the inner circle was relatively small, right? So be aware that cults don't necessarily have to be this huge, stadium-sized church. They can be small groups, but especially if there is this expectation that you need to be pure, you need to maintain fidelity to our, values and beliefs and practices only. And anytime you don't, you have to confess to me and be, offered absolution. If the cult leader says that you're allowed to have that, big red flag, huge warnings.
I still had a men's group, but it was different.
You don't understand where the deception is. You are acting entitled.
There's also going to be a sort of attitude and energy of reciprocity. There's typically a well, I did this thing for you and so you owe me now, right? I gave you a free class or some good advice or, I helped you with something and so you need to pay me back by doing this stuff for the group or by doing something that's for the good of our group or for growing the group or for the leader specifically. And so sometimes this is something as simple as a free meal, right? Like we talked about the Moonies, the Unification Church, that's the official name of the cult. They would offer people free meals and a place to hang out, especially for college students. Obviously, that was pretty alluring. Sometimes this is stuff like mystical experiences. It's sometimes a love bombing, literally with, affection and attention, but also with physical things. Gifts and assistance as well. But often they'll sort of pull you into a tit for tat, right? I scratched your back and so you owe me your time, your labor, your attention, or to recruit more members. This was an instrumental part of the NXIVM cult growing in the way that it did, but also literally we have footage of the leader from the Twin Flames universe talking about this.
There's a group of women that have signed a vow. They've given things as collateral, and they're trying to recruit other women to do this.
My business depends on all of you, and I want to make sure that all of you are doing your jobs.
Okay, so with that then, with all of this expectation of reciprocity and being more committed and, make sure that you're openly and obviously committing to all of our values, this is where we start to get into weird territory, right? This is when we start to have these attitudes about the Lifton principle is called doctrine over person and the dispensing of existence. This is where we start to see things like the group saying that we have the right to decide who is allowed to live and die, right? We get to decide who is a real person who's worthy of respect. And also that commitment to our group requires you to abandon your previous self. Very reminiscent of the fundamentalist Christian talking point about dying to yourself, right? Red flag. very, very problematic belief to have, because ultimately what they're saying is that you're not allowed to be an individual, a person, to have your own thoughts, to have your own beliefs, to have your own morals or values, and to have behavior that is anything other than what is expressly approved of by the group and by the cult leader. I think Synanon is a great example here. There were forced sterilizations and forced remarriage because Chuck Diedrich, his wife died, and so he just decided, like, musical chairs, we're doing all of that now, which again is like a pretty extreme example, but I want to use it for illustration purposes. I'll show you. For what it's worth, also Scientology, I think some of their practices are a great example for what this can potentially look like. Again, I'm not accusing Scientology of being a cult, but rather using some of their practice to simply illustrate a point for you. The concept of suppressive persons in Scientology is a great example, in my opinion, because ultimately, I'll show you the screenshot, but ultimately their doctrine about this is that if you are a suppressive person, meaning that you have done something to sort of be worthy of scorn from the Church of Scientology, that you are sort of dead to us, right? You're not allowed to be part of our group, that we reject you, we're kicking you out, and we don't associate with you anymore. And anybody who is part of the group is also not allowed to associate with you, because if they do, then they can become a suppressive person, and sort of on, right? It's this very insular attitude that if you do anything outside of the group's values, get out. You're not allowed to be here, and you're like sort of dead to us. That's what this value is going to look like. Besides that, though, I do want to be clear that it's not necessarily just these things. It's not always overt behaviors, right? Sometimes the things that keep people stuck are more internal. There's a lot of discussion about the concept of cognitive dissonance in regard to cults, because we typically, in the recruitment phase where we're sort of moving down this pipeline, people are going to experience a sense of cognitive dissonance, right? Because what's happening is that while you're being told this thing, there's a part of you that feels like this is wrong, right? Or maybe this is harmful to me and I don't like it. And so I'm unsure and I feel weird about this, and I don't really like these things that are sort of pushing and pulling me. But when we are wanting to commit to a group because we lack community, because we've been promised self-actualization or, to level up in our lives, we can rationalize those things to ourselves, right? We tell ourselves, well, maybe if I just don't look too hard at it, right? Maybe if I just dissociate for a little while, don't think too hard about it, then ultimately this will be worth it for me and it will all start to make sense, right? This is also a selling point here, is that I just don't get it yet because I'm not immersed enough in the group. And so I'll just wait a little while, right? I can rationalize this away for a little while and just hope that it will make more sense later on down the line, which is a very dangerous thing, obviously, when we're talking about a cult, because the further down that pipeline you get, the more difficult it is for you to actually leave. I know that I bore everybody with the concept of cognitive inflexibility also, because we talk about it in almost every video, but it's really important. We talked about it in the QAnon video and in the Chronically Online video. Cognitive flexibility essentially allows us to be people who can stomach or can tolerate distress and uncertainty and a sort of, a sense of nuance in our lives and in the world. But cognitive inflexibility, conversely, it's often imposed by a cult, where they're telling you that you're not allowed to tolerate a sense of ambivalence or uncertainty because either you're in or you're out, right? Also a very common fundamentalist Christian talking point, that you can't be a real Christian if you believe things like queer people being worthy of human rights and love and affection, right? This is that sense of cognitive inflexibility that they're going to impose on you, again, to decrease your level of critical thinking, to stunt your emotional growth, to make it more difficult for you to hold that space for yes and, so as to try to push you further down that pipeline. Along with that, though, there's a sense of shame and embarrassment, right? This is why we talked about in the QAnon video, if you want to be somebody who can help someone escape that group, shaming people, judging people, embarrassing them, using public humiliation is actually your enemy. Because if you can imagine, for any of us who've ever done anything that's embarrassing, or when we've been wrong about something, we don't want to admit that. Nobody wants to admit that, but especially when we have publicly and openly committed to something that's fucking weird, or when we have alienated our family, when we've cut off all of our real and sort of earthly ties to community and social interaction, that's a little embarrassing to be like, oops, I got. This sense of shame and embarrassment turns into sort of a sunk cost fallacy, right? Well, I'm already fucking in it now, and so maybe I should stay. But it's also kind of the Dunning-Kruger thing, right? I'm too smart to be in a cult. Surely I would not fall for something that's silly. I think that I'm too intelligent to be a victim of a cult. And so, no, that's not what this is, right? This is why we see things like Trump supporters saying, even though, my wife got deported or my family has died, that I don't regret my vote. I still believe in, Trump's supremacy, because it's too difficult for folks who have suffered with that much cognitive inflexibility to contend with the reality that they've been manipulated and that they have been had. Most people don't really want to admit that, and especially when you have been subjected to a lot of manipulation and psychological torture in some cases, we are not really in a place to admit that. Besides that, though, often what will happen, even when folks do have a little bit of an inkling that maybe things are starting to get hinky here, even if we're able to bypass the cognitive inflexibility and the shame and the Dunning-Kruger and the fear and all of that stuff, there's also sometimes a very real lack of resources to actually leave the group, right? A lot of people had terrible things to say about Anna Duggar, which, to be fair, the way that she parents her children is fucking terrible. And having a complete and utter lack of resources in the outside world makes it very difficult for you to even think about challenging all of the, risk factors, the barriers that we talked about before, because if you don't have anywhere to go, you don't have money, you don't have education, you don't have a way to make money or to get an education, you don't have transportation, you don't have any contacts on the outside world, and you have absolutely no idea about what to do or how to even live your life outside of this group, it's very difficult then to actually defect from a cult, because that lack of practical resources sometimes means that you have to abandon your whole life, right? Everything that you've ever known, especially for children who have grown up in cults, everything that you've ever known, every meaningful relationship that you have in your life is contained within this very insular group. And so what are you supposed to do? That it's a very difficult thing. I think we should be much more understanding for folks who struggle in this sort of like no man's land of like, I don't want to be here and I feel like this is weird, but I don't really know what to do, because turning your back on everything that you've ever known, abandoning your community, and also bearing the scarlet letter of doing that is a very daunting task. There's also going to be that like double bind thing that we talked about earlier, right? In those moments where we're feeling like, I don't want to be here and I don't like it here and I'm scared of this and people are harming me. Well, maybe it's because I'm not committed enough. Maybe it's because I'm not invested enough. And so maybe I should dive deeper into scripture. I should take another class. I should read another booklet. I should do another meditation with our group leader, because surely that will provide me with the transcendence and the information and the improvement to myself and to my mind and to my heart that I'll finally get it. The answers will finally become clear. Our group leader will finally be able to conduit and to channel a message from our deity or from the universe or whatever that will illuminate for me why I feel so bad about this. And then all of my anxiety and my fear will go away, right? This is a very seductive messaging. And so even for people who have doubts, which often people do, there are a lot of checkpoints in place that are designed to psychologically manipulate people into staying. So like I said, combined, this is all going to add up to this picture of people who have a fanatical and sometimes dangerous commitment to these groups. And also that those people who have like a fully committed and dangerous and fanatical commitment are going to like sort of push down the other people who have doubts like whack-a-mole. And that's the phase at which we start to see more insidious behaviors like the Manson family murders, the mass murder suicides in Jonestown, the NXIVM sex trafficking allegations, the deaths from Heaven's Gate, the 8 passengers, family abuse, the forced partnerships that have been alleged in the Twin Flames universe, the alleged brainwashing and memory implantation that we've seen allegations for from Teal Swan's group. That's the phase at which we start to see things. And so when we, as the public, become aware of those things, of course, our thought is like, I would never do that, right? And like, sure, I think those people who were subject and victims of those things would probably have never done that if we had just put that in their lap, right? But the point is that cults are not groups that lead with like, hey, we should commit atrocities, right? No one does that. What happens is that over time, slowly, we increase that window of tolerance little by little until we get to the place that people are actually subject and amenable to doing these things, or they're just so scared to turn their back that they're forced into doing these things. And that's when we start to see, again, like tragedies and ultimately like the very nefarious acts that are in the end stages of cults. So I think the question for everybody then is like, well, what do we do with that information, right? That's a little scary. Thanks for being a downer, Mickey. And like we talked about in the propaganda video, I want to encourage everybody to please remember that all of us are vulnerable to psychological manipulation and groupthink and propaganda and tactics like these because our brains all work relatively similarly, right? I tell my clients all the time, having a brain is such a blessing and a curse because it's an incredibly nuanced and intelligent and sophisticated piece of technology almost, right? There's like big wet sack of electricity in our brains. It's like actually really cool and capable of a lot of stuff. And sometimes they're stupid. They're so fucking dumb because they're predictable and they can be manipulated in these ways because our biology is relatively consistent. And so we need to remember that we are all very much vulnerable to these things, and to actually think that you're not vulnerable to that you're too intelligent, that you're too smart, that you're way better than everyone else makes you vulnerable, in fact, to cults and groups like this. So be aware of that. Please never tell yourself that like, oh, that would never happen to me, because it can, right? This is a safety promoting behavior to tell ourselves, well, maybe I could, and so I should be healthily skeptical of these things, and I should talk with my safe people about it. I should Google these things, right? I should look at some historical examples. I should check out this person's presence online. Be a very conscientious consumer of information, and especially information that comes from very, very insular groups. We really want to be looking for warning signs. And like I said earlier, I always want to encourage people to forever and always maintain at least one contact on the outside of that group, because that is ultimately one of the most safety promoting things that we can do. And also that if we're somebody who's on the outside and we know a loved one, a family member who's part of a group that we're starting to get like, right, be a person who is a safe person for them to talk to and to air out their doubts and their fears and their concerns. Leading with judgment and shame and humiliation causes people to turn away from you and to turn deeper into the cult. So being a person, if you're able to, if you have the spoons for that, being a person who is open to that and safe for them to talk with you about those things is one of the most effective ways that we can help gently coax somebody out of a dangerous group like that, including QAnon, including religious groups, including things that are, progressive or leftist or things that have gone too far. All of those types of groups, when we talk about cult escape, being that person or having people who can be a safe place for you to land is one of the most instrumental interventions. Above all, like I said, maintaining a healthy skepticism of any group, especially when they're promising you big things, right? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I want to share with you a quote actually from one of the pieces of research that I used for this video because I think it sums this up great. When you meet the friendliest people you have ever known who introduce you to the most loving group of people you've ever encountered, and you find the leader to be the most inspired, caring, and compassionate and understanding person you've ever met, and then you learn that the cause of the group is something you never dared to hope could be accomplished, and all of this sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. Don't give up your education, your hopes, and your ambitions to follow a rainbow. That woman, Jeannie Mills, was actually a group of the People's Temple, the Jonestown cult, and she was able to escape, which is notably very rare. 900 people died in the Jonestown mass murders. And so I think her advice is pretty pertinent here and honestly very sobering. So again, I want to encourage people to be conscientious consumers and healthily skeptical of groups, and especially like these very, insular ideals, because right now we are in an era where there's a lot of extremism. There is a lot of, extraordinary claims being made about things, and it's important that we diversify our social groups and our social interaction, and especially be people who are open to unlearning things about ourselves that are problematic and helping other people to unlearn those things. And so ultimately, again, this is like a safety promoting behavior. I don't think I need to say this for what it's worth. Cults are obviously very bad for your mental health. They're incredibly traumatizing as well. And so especially if you have survived a high control group and you're in the process of deconstructing and unlearning that, please know that there are always therapists who are wonderful people that are willing to help you walk through that. There's always links in my description, by the way, if you want to find a therapist who is affordable or inclusive or more accessible. I do make a conscientious, concerted effort. Have links in the description always for you guys. Again, I don't get paid for them. It's just because I love you guys. So check that out if you need a therapist, because again, there are very much wonderful and capable and incredible therapists who can help walk people through the trauma recovery of that. So if you guys have other questions about cults, about high control groups, and about other things, put those in the comments. I can answer them, as they come up. But otherwise, if you like the video, you can subscribe. We do talk about stuff like this. We also talk about fun stuff that I'd love to have you stay for. And then you can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.